Hey, Lance here, the Vintage Speaker Audiophile. I thought I'd do a video on the channel, just to give you an idea of what we're trying to focus on and what were some of the motivations for the channel. Started this about 9 months ago, and so far we've gotten a fair amount of traction, and I think it's because we've really started to look at some things that are beyond what was the original intention of the channel. I mean, early on, what I was focusing on was vintage speaker repair because that's what I have done. I kind of went overboard at one point, and I had about 50 pairs of speakers hooked up, mostly to dedicated amp channels. I didn't have a lot of speaker selector switches. And I had them all set up so that they imaged pretty well at the listening position. I had a swivel rocker, and I just had a blast. And every one of these I took apart, I upgraded the capacitors and the crossover, repaired things, refinished some things. I just had a blast. But one of the things I learned with all those speakers, because I was buying and selling them, is that there was issues with, regard to stereo listening that people just didn't understand, or were probably kind of lost to history. And the big one that popped up right away was imaging and soundstage. A good setup stereo, when you're sitting in the sweet spot, will deliver three-dimensional sound. And if you've never heard that before, that's probably something that you'll not relate to. Because if you've never heard it, you've never heard it. And if you've never heard it, you've only heard music or dialogue coming out of each speaker, and you haven't had the speakers just disappear into the room. When I was selling all my speakers, I estimated that less than 10% of my buyers understood stereo imaging and soundstage. So that's something I kind of took as a challenge here to see if we could educate more folks on it. The other thing we've looked at a little bit is how we perceive music. I have a number of videos on that, and I like to talk about the fact that our hearing changes over time as well, and how our perception doesn't seem to change even though our hearing changes. So us older audiophiles should take into account that we're not hearing quite as good as we used to. I've done a few videos on those. I'll cover hardware and technology, but in a limited standpoint. I mean, there's plenty of channels out there that review hardware, and I don't need to do that. But I will occasionally do stuff that's interesting. Like I recently did a review of my JBL L88s, which I just love. The idea behind the channel is stereo from a different perspective. I want to cover things that you haven't thought of before, and I want to cover them in ways that invoke your thought on the subject. I mentioned that I was a kind of a crazy speaker hoarder, and I've probably repaired or refurbished, bought and sold over 100 speakers in my day. I've done some work with electronics too. I've recapped a number of my amplifiers, but I would never call myself a adequate electronics repair person. I'm convinced that's something that just you need to tutor under someone that really knows what they're doing, and kind of apprentice for months or maybe a couple of years before you really can get into that. So while I really tried to do electronics repair, I kind of gave up on that. But I am a peer researcher. I love the interesting topics, and I dig into them about stereo and find all sorts of interesting things. One of the videos I've done was on adding a center channel to your system to improve stereo imaging. Now, most people will think, well, that's no big deal. People add center channels all the time because they have that for surround sound, and that's true today. But actually, adding a center channel was being looked at hard back in the 1950s as a way to improve imaging because, as I mentioned before, you really need to be sitting in the sweet spot to hear all this three-dimensional sound. But interesting to note here is the Klipsch heresy story, which the heresy was intended as a center channel for Klipsch horns. And according to legend, Paul Klipsch was describing the center channel to some of his engineers, and someone said, "A center channel for two channel, that's heresy." And he said, "Yes, that's what it is, and that's what I'm going to call it." So there's interesting things back here that we haven't looked at for a long time. I like to address misconceptions, and my pet peeve is all these videos on YouTube or wherever that have a disclaimer that say you should use your headphones for the best results. And the reason for that is because, again, stereo imaging and soundstage is lost to history. If your stereo speakers are set up properly and you've got a decent system and you're sitting in the sweet spot, your sound in terms of 3 dimensions is going to actually be better than headphones. I invite you all to try it, and I've done a video on demoing this with movie codec demos, which is kind of cool. Is how you can hear the helicopters and the airplanes coming from behind you and screaming by your ears, things like that. The other thing we've talked a fair amount about is lossy versus lossless audio. There's a number of streamer software providers that will provide lossless audio files, and I'm just going to say they're better. They're just better. However, not everybody can hear the difference, and not in every system. The days of old, primitive MP3 files are gone. There are now high-resolution compressed audio files that are much better than they used to be, and depending on certain parameters and bit rates, they'll start to rival what lossless audio files can achieve. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I love talking about YouTube. YouTube is my favorite streaming source, even though it's not lossless. But my 61-year-old ears can't hear the difference. And the sheer volume of quantity of information out there on YouTube is just so worth it. I've done a few videos on cabling and internals and things like that. And we'll continue to do more of that. But first thing here is to entertain and educate. I did a video on why are audiophiles considered snobs. So I would I like to poke fun at audiophiles a little bit, especially the ones at the extreme. The latest thing I've read about is you not only have to have really, really good cables for your stereo, but you have to have cable risers to get them up off the floor. And I don't know about that. I certainly believe there are people can hear the difference on systems that they have, but I really doubt if I can hear the difference. Focus here is mainly on streaming. I've abandoned my vinyl, and I never really had a cassette set up, but I'm streaming now exclusively, and I'm exclusively streaming through YouTube, through an Amazon Fire Cube, into a Denon 3808 AVR, into various power amps, into various speakers, and I like my environment. I spent a lot of time setting it up and getting it just right, and I haven't had to modify it for a long, long time. I like to swap out speakers because I have lots of pairs of speakers. I still have probably 20 pair, and I like to swap them in and out. My current favorites are my JBL L88s that I have set up near field. I did a video on those. And I'm trying to take them down, but I can't seem to take them down because I like them too much. So anyway, here I thought I'd do a quick update on the channel. We're at about 1,500, 1,600 subscribers, and I'm pretty happy with that result. If we can get the viewing hours up, I can monetize. So I'm kind of looking forward to that. Anyway, Lance here, vintage speaker audiophile. Smash the like and the subscribe button if you found value in this.